Hey guys, hope you're doing well. This is a different format than our lecture that we did on our PowerPoint. This I want to draw some stuff out because I think it works a little bit better to some degree in terms of explaining what we have in textbook. And what we're talking about now is our Unit 2. And this was both our history of contact lenses, which we went through both in the reading and in the videos that we put up. And I think the history is very important, but there's also the anatomy of, or the nomenclature of, a contact lens. And what is that? That's just, how do we talk about it? What are the parts of it? How do we put it together? And we'll get into more detail on how we change it to make it fit well, how they work, what the powers are. But in a nutshell, you guys already know that if I had a ophthalmic lens that was a one diopter base curve on the front surface of an ophthalmic add the two algebraically, and you get approximately a -7 diopter lens. And front versus back, now obviously there's something to do with the thickness or something to do with the index of refraction, but in a nutshell, the real basics are a +1 -8 gives me a -7. So this is like we did with grinding curves homework, where if I give you the base curve and the power, you tell me what the grinding curves are, which is the back curve. If I give you the front curve and the back curve, you can tell me what the power is, or any combination. If I give you two, you can give me the third. Well, contact lenses are very similar, except the back surface of if we're talking about contact lenses, they're, for all practical intents and purposes, little baby ophthalmic lenses, but they're just much smaller. And they're much thinner. And they're much steeper. So you have this little thing that looks like such. Well, if I blow that up, and instead of dealing with 50mm lenses, we're dealing with 10mm lenses, let's take our little contact lens and blow it up. Now instead of powers like a -8 on the back, we're doing lenses that are going to match approximately the curvature and shape of a normal human cornea. And remember, the overall curvature, the overall refractive power of a normal, quote unquote, average eye is around 60 diopters. The average, the cornea is generally about 70, 65, 66, 70% of that. So generally, most people's corneas are generally, on average, around 43 diopters, not 8 diopters, but 43. So the numbers we're going to start using are, you'll see 41s, 43s, 50s, high 30s, those types of things, but the numbers are slightly different, so you have to wrap your mind around that. But essentially, if I had a +45 front curve and a -43 back curve, this would give me a -2 contact lenses. The principles are all the same. There's nothing new in how we do the lenses, except the numbers look a little different. But if you know how to calculate grinding curves on an eyeglass lens using the front and back curve, this is essentially what we're doing with contacts, with some differences. Now, when I grind a lens for the frame in an eyeglass, I'm trying to make sure that it fits in the eyeglass frame. Here, our biggest concern is, does the back curve essentially match with a person's cornea? Because this is supposed to go, let me use a different one. If you're looking at the contact lens, ideally, the back of that contact lens, for all practical intents and purposes, let's say the blue was the cornea, we want that red contact lens, that back surface, to relatively fit on the blue patient's cornea. If it's the wrong size, the wrong shape, it becomes problematic. We're not even going to get into that at this point. But I just wanted to point out to you that if you know eyeglasses, contacts are not that much of a different of a step. So what we're dealing with is, here's my contact. It's got a back curve of, say, 40, 43. It's got a front curve. And we can determine the power. Now in an eyeglass lens, we have these sharp edges for a minus lens. We have these sharp edges for a plus lens. Well, you don't want to put a contact lens on somebody's cornea that's got sharp edges like this. That's just not how this works. When the person's eyelid blinks and goes over this edge, we don't want there to be big bumps here. So there are some adjustments we have to make sure that the contact lens fits well and follows with the eye anatomy. So what we do is there's a back curve on this lens. And then to make sure it's not so sharp, we're going to sort of blend this away so that when the eyelids come on up and down, it's not going to scratch anything. And also what's really cool is when I have the back surface of the contact match the cornea, we do want there every time, remember the lacrimal glands and the accessory lacrimal glands produce tears constantly. They're exposed to the oxygen, and every time that you blink with a gas permeable lens, the lens moves a little bit. When it moves a little bit, it sits on this layer of tear, and there's actually a pumping action where a lot of the old tear that has expended its oxygen in the tears to the epithelium, as you blink, new oxygenated tear goes through this. So there's like pumping method. There's always fresh tear with oxygen coming through and bathing the front of the patient's cornea. Plus, remember we talked about decay values and oxygen going through the lenses. So I've got oxygen going through the lens, I've got oxygen coming in through the tears, what have you. In order for these tears to go through here though, I can't have it closed off where it just fits. So oftentimes what we do is we take just the edges of the back of the contact and we shave it down a little bit like such and like such. And what that's going to do is now, let's get rid of that little cornea. So now we're going to have a back curve that's a single curves like such. We're going to have slightly flatter curves, and then we're going to round the edge off. Flatter curve, round the edge off. So the whole contact will have a couple measurements that we talk about. And one of them is how this contact lens, if we're looking at, has a diameter from here to here. The whole thing, how wide is the contact lens? We're going to deal with primarily gas permeable lenses for this semester, and most of these are going to be about 8.5 to about 10 millimeters. And again, you don't have to worry about that too much because we'll get into it more specific, but essentially how big is the contact lens? How wide is the contact lens? This zone here, right, where we have these little peripheral curves, we call them, right there and right here. Well, here's the whole contact lens, but then we have this little bit that we took off from the side view, and then we have the central part of the lens. So this right here, when we're talking about the width, we call it the optic zone width. This is the optic zone. That's the lens. That's what's going to be fitting on the eye, and hopefully they'll be looking through that, and off you go. It also has, so we can specify this as the posterior or back of the contact lens optic zone. So sometimes you'll actually see it referred to as the optic zone or the posterior optic zone. And we can measure how wide it is. That's the optic zone width. And there's another characteristic, and that is how steep is it? We need to know how flat it is or how steep it is based on the contact, the person's cornea that we're going to put it on. And so either the base curve or we can sometimes call it the posterior curve radius, or we'll sometimes just say what is the radius of curvature of this particular curve. And we'll get into what makes it steeper, what makes it flatter. But again, there's this section here, there's the overall diameter, there's the two peripheral curves, and there's the middle part of the lens, and that's essentially what fits on the contact lens. So this middle part is the optic zone. These curves on the edges, sometimes there's just one extra curve, a bicurve lens. Those are just my peripheral curves. Sometimes we'll put a series of curves here just to make it more complicated. So there'll be one curve here, another curve here, and so there'll be multiple ones. We would call that the intermediate curves and the posterior curves. And I'll show you additional stuff on your reading. This should go along with your reading, remember. So, and if I looked at it from a standpoint of, let me share this. And maybe this will be a little bit better to look at. Imagine if you had a chunk of plastic here, and we have these little buttons that we manufacture, really cool. And you have the front curve that we're going to be looking at. Well, we want to make the back curve. And so this is about what's going to match the how steep the patient's cornea is. But we remember we want to get rid of these little edges off to the side. So we're going to get this off as well. So what you're looking at when you're left with it, you've got this part of the contact lens, so this is my optic zone, and you've got these peripheral curves. If you looked at it face in, this is what it sort of looks like from the front. So what we're looking at is, if you can imagine, from top to bottom is what's called the overall diameter. From this line to this line is your optic zone, and I can tell you how wide it is, the optic zone width. You have the overall diameter. And then these little areas here, this is where we have those posterior curves. And a lot of times if you look at it, this is what the actual photo looks like. But if we can imagine, we've got the overall diameter. We've got that inside part, which is the optic zone. We've got two peripheral curves. And so what we generally do is we'll say the outside one is the most peripheral, so that's a peripheral curve. This one's also a peripheral curve, but because it's in between the two, it would be an intermediate curve. So if I just took this photograph, that's my overall diameter. And that gives you an idea of what it looks like. So let me keep going here. So let me show you this here. So if we looked at that picture before, that's my overall diameter. That's my peripheral curves. These little blue ones are my intermediate curves or secondary curve. And that's my optic zone width. So again, from a standpoint of what a contact lens looks like, so now if I showed you this one right here, hopefully gave you the idea of now we've got the front curve of the lens. That's where the power is going to be. We've got my optic zone diameter. This is essentially what fits on the eye. This is very pronounced. The secondary curve and the peripheral curves, the intermediate curve and the peripheral curves are never this big. Normally they're very small, like such. This optic zone is generally very wide, but for our purposes, this, to make it easier to see, we just accentuated these here. So we've got this back optic zone is what fits on the eye, and how wide it is generally specified in millimeters, and how curved it is will give us our base curve radius, all the different ways that you specify it. There's a handful of different ways to do that. But we'll specify later on how we change this, how we make it curved more, curved less. And again, the more curved, the steeper a patient's cornea is, or the more refractive power it has, this will have to be steeper to fit it well. If the patient's eye is flat, this has to be flat. These curves tend to be a little flatter as we get off to the edges. And then what we do is make sure this is not too sharp, so we sort of blend it away. And if we do this properly, and if we fit it the right size, the right curvature, the right peripheral curves, the right material that will breathe well and be comfortable, we can slap this on a person's eye. And if it is a rigid gas permeable, it'll sit there, it'll fit there, and it'll be great. So at any event, I wanted to show you the nomenclature in terms of when you see a base curve. The base curve is actually the back curve of the contact lens. And remember, in eyeglasses, that's a different ball game. The base curve's on the front. For our purposes, you don't have to remember why. You don't have to learn why. That's a whole additional lecture if you ever want to find out. But for our purposes, when we talk about the base curve of a contact, It's the back curve of the lens that goes on the patient's eyeball, on their cornea. So at any event, I felt that some of these would be useful to sort of point out in addition to your reading. Nothing exciting. My guess is most of you could have gotten this right without any assistance, but I thought by explaining it a little bit more clearly, or maybe a different take on it in addition to your reading, it would help out. So be that as it may, that was it for today. Really brief, just a little nugget size clarity or explanation to what's in your textbook, and that's about it. So appreciate it, guys. We'll talk to you in a bit.